Uh, Good afternoon. Welcome back for the final session on cities and climate change, which is a very important topic. Um, with IPCC actually uh, declaring a report on cities and climate change, a special report on cities and climate change. I'll just give a context and then ask the speakers one by one to come and present the latest, what research is going on cities and what are the challenges and what needs to be taken care of. So just providing the context, cities are the key contributors to climate change as urban areas contribute to 70% of the global emissions by 2050. 68% of the global population will be living in urban areas. At COP26, more than 1,000 cities and local governments representing more than 700 to 22 million people joined the cities race to zero. Sea level rise is already impacting 25 megacities. About 21% of climate finance share is allocated to adaptation and resilience. However, only 10% reach the local level. In 2023, IPCC Use of Scenarios workshop recommended the global research need to bridge with urban modelers. There is a need to initiate and upscale the conversation on multi-level scenarios and consistency, increase funding for science of cities, and additional emphasis to include development drives, local scenarios, especially from Global South. So with this context, I will invite Professor Minal Pathak from Ahmedabad University to give a brief context about cities, especially in Asia. Minal?
Thank you so much. Good evening. Last day, last session. I'm not a modeler, and the news from the US elections. Quite challenging. Okay, so thank you for this opportunity. And this is my first IMC meeting, and I really had a great 3 days learning. And I understand this is the first time you have cities on the agenda, and also an all-women panel. You can't see the other two, but it's an all-women panel, which is also great. How do I go to the next slide? So I am asked to present the gaps in the sixth assessment cycle on cities, and what are the challenges for Asian cities. So this is not probably new for a lot of people. Why cities and why cities here? I mean, we've heard a lot over the last 2 days, cities being the centers for activity, for demand, for growth, also high emitting centers, but also hotspots for climate impacts. And, um, and the top-down models that we've been discussing the last couple of days, they do not adequately capture the granularity. And if you look at the sectoral local level models, they fail to capture the temporal or the global aspects like the depth of emission reductions you might need or the scale of change. And there's a diversity across urban settlements that's not often captured in these type of modeling exercises. And it's not just across countries, it's also within countries, cities within states, and the diversity within cities. So I don't think that's an easy task. And another reason we should do cities probably here is that cities are key actors and emerging as more powerful actors, taking more ambitious actions. And we're seeing the global landscape, and I already talked about the US elections, that in many cases, national governments are not ambitious enough, and cities are taking the lead. The figure at the bottom shows the mitigation potentials in transport and building sectors. You probably cannot see this is from the AR6. But what we were looking at in this figure, the authors, they were trying to compile the mitigation potentials for transport and building. And you can see there are a lot of opportunities for mitigation of global studies, and there were a lot of gaps. You can probably see the uncertainty ranges. So we need more literature on the mitigation potentials for urban areas and for different type of urban areas. And the figure at the top shows the extent, the urban areas in 2100 under SSP2. And you can see the red ones, which is the large cities over 10 million, and the orange ones, which is 1 to 5 million, all happening in Asia. This is actually talking about Asian cities, and that the fastest growing cities are going to be in Asia. They're already in Asia. And in future, a lot of urban expansion is going to happen in China and India. And China will stabilize eventually at 2050, and India will still continue to grow after 2050 in terms of urban expansion. Also, many of these cities are responsible for a bulk of national emissions, if you talk about consumption-based emissions. And we all know that the usual suspects are often overstudied, and the small and medium cities are not adequately represented in literature. We also work with contexts where the data is very sparse. So you don't probably have baseline emission inventories for some of these data. So we really have to look at energy balances, and starting points for a lot of cities are missing. So it's not, obviously, as I mentioned, an easy task. The graph at the top shows the fastest growing cities between 2000 and 2020. You can see Bahrain and some of these not very well known, not the usual suspects there. So the fastest growing cities are not always the largest cities. And at the bottom, you see the larger cities where the increase is absolute number of people, whether it's in migration or population increase. So it's like you can use different metrics and you'll get a different picture. So this is the top emitters. Not surprisingly, a lot of them are in China. This is from Moran et al., which looked at 13,000 settlements globally. And you can see the hotspots being in East Asia, but also in India and a few in West Asia. So the blue is, I think, the top 10 is red, top 50 is orange, and global top 100 is blue. So obviously, Asian cities, like I said, are very diverse. So the photo at the top is from the city where I'm from, Ahmedabad city. And you can see people walking and cycling. That's the old city. But if you actually take a picture of the western part of the city, you'll see SUVs and tall buildings. So it's also a lot of diversity within cities and the way the growth is happening. And some of this doesn't get captured when you look at the long term. But it's important for decision making in the short term. And as has been said many times today, that in many of the cities, there's a large population which still has unmet development needs. We'll not go into whether this is housing, number of kilometers, floor space, but yes, this is a reality as well for Asian cities. This chart shows the net zero commitments of cities. This only includes the cities which have committed to net zero, Asian cities, and not the ones that have not, because that would be hundreds. So the level of commitment on the left shows whether net zero commitment is in law, the green bar showing as policy document, whether it's a declaration, which is light blue, and whether it's proposed or just being discussed. So you can obviously see that East Asia is leading, and fewer cities in West and Central Asia and South Asia have committed to net zero. And you can see also that cities have pledged, but if you actually go deeper into these plans, only a few use long-term modeling to support these net zero plans. I think there are only a handful. Like I saw Kuala Lumpur is being supported by GCAM team and a few others, but a lot of these cities are just looking at intensity reduction or sectoral targets, or yeah, just some sectoral action as a compilation to net zero. So there's a long way to go, I guess, and to support these cities to realize these net zero plans. On the right, we have the net zero target year for many cities, and you can see some cities actually having as ambitious as 2030, 2040, or 2045, but large number of cities have 2050 as their target year. I want to dive into a couple of slides on our work. That's Gujarat state in Western India, where we are from. And this is a UN-supported project. Our partner team is here. Vaibhav Chaturvedi was somewhere here. So if you have any questions on GCAM, please ask him. Um, I wanted to look at, so started looking at urbanization and GDP projections. We went to the state government, and they thought 56 to 60 was not ambitious. The state wants to go to 80% urban. In terms of GDP growth, we are growing at 7% for the next 2.5 decades and 6% after that. You can see the per capita GDP increase expectation. This is the state government expectation. So from $2,500 in 2020 to $62,000 in 2020 prices. The residential floor space will increase 4 times. The commercial by, I think, 10 times. And the passenger transport increases 3 times. Now, under this level of growth ambition, to get to net zero for the state, as you can imagine, is not easy for the modeling team. That's the results from the GCAM exercise. I'm not going to go into the detail, but the left, which is the reference scenario, shows the increase in energy demand by 7 times. And in the net zero scenario, it decreases by 15%, largely because of electrification. So if you want to go with this level of commitment to GDP growth, it's going to be really challenging to get to net zero unless we look at structural change, like reduce the share of manufacturing. So for some of these kind of exercises at the subnational level, you need probably the IIMs, and the sectoral or local level Excel-based models may not be able to give us these results. That's a deeper dive into the city. This is the work of one of our PhD students in the department. On the left, so she looked at 7 different residential typologies in the state. So everything from slums to large houses. If we pack them into 2 categories, on the left, base year, apartments and individual housing. If you look at 2050, the share of apartments is obviously going up and the individual housing is going down. But when you start unpacking the apartments into the future, you also have like multi-storied apartments, so 25 stories, 50 stories. Within those categories, you have floor space. And I'd like to point out to the last row. I don't know how to point from here. Maybe this is, oops. Okay, let's see. Sorry, I can't find the pointer, but the last row on luxury apartments has floor area of 90 to 120 square meters, which is not luxury by other global standards. So I just wanted to point out, we were discussing the needs and aspirations. So yeah, so she used the aim and use model. And we simplified it because the idea was only to look at the residential sector. But even then, with this level of construction, the additional area will be 250 meters square just for the city. And adopting circular economy can get us 49% reduction in steel sector emissions. But this would not have been possible without the model. But if we further look at floor area reductions, then you can get more. But that's not an easy story to sell. So right now on the left, at the bottom, you can see the city, which is mostly low and medium rise. But the future is going to be almost high-rise apartments. So so this is also key takeaways that Saritha was talking about. So in AR6, we had, after AR6 was published, we had a scenarios meeting. I think some of you were there at that meeting. And what came out was that you do need to link the global models with the local activity data somehow to link these models that can provide better results from the global models. To look at the diversity of cities, so small, medium, large, fast growing, slow growing, but mainly also development levels. That, like I said, within Asia, there's like cities with very different development levels. And of course, focus on the underrepresented regions and cities. The scenarios meeting also recommended that storylines and scenarios should look at environmental change. So additional influence beyond GDP, what kind of infrastructure, committed infrastructure that cities will have to build. And all of these cities are going to go into lock-ins. So there's also the other questions of how you build the cities that influence emissions. And a few studies now have started looking at urban expansion and the land requirement for urban areas. And this literature is emerging, but it needs better resolution. So for example, a lot of these urban areas are taking up croplands. What does it mean for interlinked challenges like food security at the local level? There's also calls for looking at cross-sectoral strategies. So what does, for example, built form and transport do to emissions? And are there co-benefits to linking these two sectors? There's also, of course, the urban heat island effect and flooding to be studied, but urban interactions with climate at the micro scale, at the meso scale, and of course at the high level urbanization. So in terms of scenario narratives, I heard this at the meeting that we need more development-driven scenario. We had a good discussion at lunch. What does a development scenario look like? It, I think, in my opinion, looks like a scenario where in cities, everybody has adequate housing, can travel where they want to, probably with cleaner transport, but where basically basic needs are met. I'm not going to talk about aspirations, Saritha, right now. Um, but yeah, there's also gaps in adaptation scenarios. Most of the scenarios are mitigation-based scenarios. And of course, capturing demand can lead to richer storylines. But I heard a demand presentation, I think it was Alex. I think efficiency-based demand is different from people actually cutting down demand. So efficiency is like people see gains. So, you probably think there's a cost saving somewhere, but actually reducing or not using something is a different level of demand reduction. It doesn't sell in developing countries. So lower demand, yes, but low demand, difficult to talk about. We heard co-benefits for air quality and health, but there could be other co-benefits from other strategies which are not very well explored. There are also scenarios for climate and risk, but they're not mapped to the urban population that will be at risk. So probably understanding better how impacts can be linked to the mitigation scenarios. And I think that's the last one that the scenarios team came up with. A lot of these cities have net zero targets, but few of them mention urban sinks and where they will happen. So a city has a net zero target, but they think that 20% of the emissions will be offset by another city. So if at the aggregate level, there's not enough space, I think. And so final slide. On the left, you have the stuff that we've been hearing about. So carbon price, percent emission reduction, carbon budget, net zero year. And on the right, you have the policymakers talking about GDP growth and jobs and which industries will come in my city or state. Yeah, how do I increase manufacturing? So we have to find common ground. And therefore, obviously, I talked about linking the global to the local, but also caution against oversimplification, that probably using one number does not do justice to the diversity that exists in reality. I would also urge, especially the early career researchers, as Saritha has mentioned, are here in the room today to be sensitive to development challenges, the needs of populations in developing countries. Policy relevant research, it's nice to have academic exercises, but I guess also to have something that can actually contribute would be also, we are at that stage at the global level. And my last 2 points are about a lot of these cities don't have the capacity. So a lot of the policymakers that I know would not understand a fraction of the charts that we saw at the meeting. So we just have to go out there and communicate better, to talk to them, to listen, to get that feedback, to improve our assumptions. And so stakeholder inputs may not give you the answers you want to hear, but I think they're very important. We communicated our project to the state level policymakers and it was shocking because they commented critically on everything. Sometimes they don't even accept the results you show them, but it's still important to go out there and speak so that we can improve the quality of our work, but also contribute to policymaking. I'll stop here and thank you so much.
Thank you, Minal, for a really interesting presentation. And now I will ask, I think, Siir, who's, I think, online, and hopefully will be able to share her slides to provide her perspective on cities. And just for everyone, Siir Kilkis is the IPCC Vice Chair from Turkey. So, Siir.
Thank you, everyone. Can you hear me?
Can't hear you.
Can you hear me?
Just a minute.
Hello, everyone. Is my sound coming?
Yes, now we can
Yes.
hear you. Please
It's a
proceed.
pleasure to be in this plenary session for climate change and cities. And thank you, Saritha, for the excellent chairing and Minal for the presentation. So the special report on climate change and cities has been adopted in the 61st session of the IPCC in Bulgaria, Sofia. And the agreed outline contains chapters on cities in the context of climate change, framing of the report, cities in a changing climate, trends, challenges, and opportunities, actions and solutions to reduce urban risks and emissions, how to facilitate and accelerate change, as well as solutions by city types and regions. And considering also this meeting, I would like to point to several of the emphasis on the agreed outline. These are in the indicative bullets. It is focusing and emphasizing urban emission trends, including consumption-based emissions, the role of cities in emissions and mitigation, future global and city-level scenarios, considering local options, equity, sustainable development, infrastructure, and informal settlements. And there are also bullets accounted for common and context-specific urban mitigation options for spatial planning, energy, heating, cooling, electricity, existing and new buildings and infrastructure, mobility and transport, water, land, food, demand-side measures, and behavioral change, and cross-sectoral integrated approaches in urban systems. And I would like to emphasize why these bullet points are important, because according to the key findings of the sixth assessment report, the global share of emissions that can be attributed to urban areas has been increasing. So when we compare 2015 with 2020, the share increased from about 62% to 67-72%, excluding aviation, shipping, and biogenic source of emissions. And the drivers are complex, so there is challenges ahead. And when we look into the mitigation options, if there are only moderate mitigation efforts taking place in cities, then urban emissions could increase to 34 gigatons CO2 equivalent in 2050, and even more if there are low mitigation efforts. And it's only with ambitious and immediate mitigation efforts, including high levels of electrification and improved energy and material efficiency, that global consumption-based urban CO2 and methane emissions could be reduced at most 3 gigatons CO2 equivalent in 2050. And combining both results from the modeled pathways as well as evidence from the scientific literature from bottom-up perspective, so multiple lines of evidence. The ambitious mitigation efforts for established, rapidly growing and emerging cities encompasses reducing and changing urban energy and material use towards sustainable production and consumption, including compact and efficient urban forms and supporting infrastructure, electrification in combination with switching to low-carbon energy sources, and enhancing carbon uptake and storage in the urban environment, the natural carbon sinks in urban areas. We did look into typology, so looking into the emerging, rapidly growing established cities and trying to identify the entry points in an integrated mitigation strategy. So spatial planning and urban form, they are the entry points for emerging and rapidly growing cities especially. And for established cities, it is electrification because most of their infrastructure has been built and there's a lot of potential that can go into electrification-based strategies for the existing infrastructure. When we talk about electrification, why is it important? So it supports integrating the net zero energy sources in urban infrastructure across sectors, especially when there's more flexible energy demand and mobility, heating and cooling to absorb greater shares of variable renewable energy. And when we look also into the demand side, sociocultural factors, infrastructure design and use, and end-use technology adoption becomes important. When we take mobility as an example, there's also shelter. But looking into mobility, we do see options such as public transport, shared mobility, compact cities, and spatial planning, among others. In AR6, there were 3 illustrative mitigation pathways in C1 category, as you very much know. So the low demand, renewable energy, and shifting pathway sustainability. But in AR6, we also tried to connect the storylines qualitatively with these illustrative mitigation pathways. So what would an urban area look? What are the cross-cutting implications for urban areas in that illustrative mitigation pathway? And this was done for all the reference scenarios and all the illustrative mitigation pathways. I show here the ones in C1. So for renewable energy, it's about urban areas supporting the renewable energy and sustainable urban planning. Low demand is also including the increasing walkable urban form to reduce the energy demand. In shifting pathways, it's more about an integrated approach in urban planning. We do know that integration across sectors, strategies, and innovation, including sustainable development, can be more challenging, especially when there are more possible barriers in certain contexts, but there are also enablers. So this multidimensional feasibility way of looking also at not only at the scenario level, but urban mitigation options was very valuable for the key findings. As also mentioned by Saritha, there was a scenario workshop. The prospects for multi-level scenarios were one of the topics. There was emphasis on data gaps for local scenario development and the possibility to use soft linking of global models with sectoral models, and also taking into account the less researched cities. From here on, I would like to provide some perspectives of how the possibilities to increase the bidirectional modeling interactions for urban areas could possibly take place. What could be some good practices in the field that could continue to AR7? So determining the urban share in total global greenhouse gas emissions is a good practice in the field. Increasing both the quantitative and qualitative representation of urban areas in mitigation pathways is important. Possibly advancing insights from urban energy system modeling to inform the mitigation pathways. Upholding an outlook for ensuring consistency across the global, regional, national, local levels. This is also very important, could be a priority. And taking the Sustainable Development Goal linkages and multidimensional feasibility assessment of mitigation options forward. There's already been additional work done, so I was very glad to see this very recent publication on using a multi-model analysis of sustainable development pathways. And here we do see some of this the sectoral models being used to inform the mitigation pathways. The SDGs and climate action. So, for example, here, extreme poverty, risk of hunger, relative poverty rate, they are being substantially increased in 2050 under the sustainable development pathways. And they also included some multidimensional feasibility analysis, looking into the economy-driven innovation, resilient communities, managing the global commons. And additionally, there was relevant content also for urban areas, reflecting a broader shift towards sustainable cities. Direct CO2 emissions from residential and commercial buildings are reduced rapidly in all sustainable development pathways, SDPs, was one of the major findings of this publication. And I was also glad to see that the comparability of urban relevant indicators, including final energy of bus transportation, the reporting was increasing. So this is showing a comparison for selected variable of final energy, transportation, passenger bus. And another one was the floor space of residential and commercial buildings, among many others. So there is very promising progress. When we look into the new urbanization projection, so in 2050, the global populations exceed 75% in 2050, but it really depends how urbanization will take place. Will it repeat the same way of urban planning as was done in the past? Or will there be more development for green growth, low demand, sustainable development, type of development in urban areas? And how urban areas are reaching their net zero targets. So in this respect, when we look at the view of net zero targets and cities with greater than 500,000 inhabitants, there are many cities already having these pledges. 13 cities have put them into law, so it's mandatory for them to achieve the net zero targets. So if cities take the opportunity, as was also emphasized in AR6, to systematically transition urban form and infrastructure towards net zero emissions through low carbon development pathways. Having low emissions and higher success in sustainable development goals, this is a real opportunity for urban areas that could be taken in the future. For urban energy system modeling, it's a very diverse landscape. These are including all the tools and frameworks that provide quantitative system-level analyses to support local energy strategy development and decision-making. They are tools that are geared only for local-scale applications. And there are also tools that are more energy system planning on local and larger scale. So some of these are being used also for national modeling exercises, but also used for modeling the urban areas with a little bit more granularity. It's important that urban energy system models capture spatial and temporal dimensions, energy demand and supply, mobility and transport, flexibilization options, and sustainability integration. This is coming from a recent review that looked into the urban energy system models and categorizing the complex interrelations that are involved in these urban energy system models. When they looked into those characteristics that were represented and not sufficiently represented. So spatial planning, they are sometimes represented. The top score here is 5. But when we look into those red areas especially, there was an underrepresentation of transport and an underrepresentation also of flexibility. There were very few models that took flexibility as a top priority, whereas others, it was not sufficiently addressed. So according to this review, transport and flexibility was one of the underrepresented areas in urban energy system modeling. It's also important where, for example, when you have prosumers, is it on individual rooftops? Or is it more a collective photovoltaic arrangement, for example? And governments around the world, local governments, national governments, also attached with national missions, they are considering subsidies for both business models. Those for individual building prosumers as well as collective photovoltaic arrangements. And the costs of both of these options do vary. So how do we capture this in the modeling, whether it's urban energy system modeling or integrated assessment modeling is one of the other granular details. When we look at all the topics that have been almost concluding now for the 17th Integrated Assessment Modeling Consortium annual meeting, all of these topics, I would say, do relate with an urban dimension. So whether it's an assessment of national mitigation strategies, what is the urban dimension within the national mitigation strategies? Whether it's analysis of deep mitigation strategies, urban areas do have a very strong role that they could play in electrification and flexible energy demand, and many others. I would like to give some examples from 3 of the topics in the annual meeting research topics. So the national mitigation strategies, multi-level partnerships, and material demands. When we look into the urban content in nationally determined contributions, currently 39% of nationally determined contributions have moderate urban content. 34 have low or no urban content, and only 27 are included with some strong urban elements. So there's a great potential to increase. And we do see a lot of countries in Asia that do have strong urban elements. There's also a coalition for high ambition multi-level partnerships, CHAMP, to change this. So how the national governments can support cities and how cities can also support their national targets, whether it's net zero or other ambitious targets. In terms of material use, this is a very recent publication coming from scientific literature. So among 1,550 plus cities, there was a shift from remote sensing data from outward expansion, especially in 1990s, 2000s, to now upward development. And here you see the shift from more pink colors, this is representing the outward, to more blue, which is the more upward growth. And this does not calculate the material and energy ramifications of this, but pointing out that this type of change in urban development does have implications for resource use. Again, continuing with the research topics, so there's very glad to see the multidimensional feasibility, sustainable development. There are urban dimensions of enabling sustainable development pathways. So all of these are very promising. I would again like to give some examples from possible joint implementation of some climate and water targets, the local context for urban climate finance, as well as some avoided impacts that could be enabled by enhancing and increasing the urban mitigation. When we look at those cities that are the top 200 largest greenhouse gas emitting cities, and those involving top emitting 500 companies, so this was the sample, there are some cities with and without net zero targets, located in basins with extremely high water stress. So it's possible that these cities could also collaborate within the Earth system boundaries to increase in living in that safe and just corridor. When we look at urban mitigation finance flows, so this was found to amount to about $814 billion, while an average needs was more than that, so more than 5 times that to 4,328 billion USD in 2030. And there's very detailed analysis on the needs for transport, buildings and infrastructure and energy for the urban level. And this is showing a recent publication, not maybe all cities represent, but quite a few from the World Health Organization. So when they looked into the particulate matter 2.5 and particulate matter 10 concentrations, 24% of settlements were not within the World Health Organization air quality guidelines. And we did also see from last week, the recent publication on the Lancet Countdown to Health, that health and climate change are very much integrated, and possibly increasing those efforts that could improve air quality could also be one of the synergies. So in an outlook for the future, towards the special report on climate change in cities, what can be done more? There's plenty of research efforts out there, many advances. And I would be interested in proposing possibly how the Integrated Assessment Modeling Consortium could consider a cross-cutting scientific sub-working group with a urban focus, or possibly a theme also in the next meeting. So with this presentation and contribution to the panel, I would like to thank you very much and encourage all of you to also consider and increase the urban dimension within the exciting and very promising research that is coming out of this research community, and emphasize that the representation of the urban dimension even more is very important for the upcoming special report on climate change and cities towards sustainable development. So thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you, Shir. Thank you, Shir. That was a fantastic presentation, basically summarizing on the context, the tools required, and how we should now also look at the urban dimension in the next IMC. Now I would request the final presenter, I think Jessie, who's representing the Climate Policy Initiative, to talk about cities' climate finance, which is equally an important topic. Jessie?
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for having me be a part of this. Sorry I can't be there in person. Thank you, Siir. You jumped the gun a bit and shared some of the results from the State of Cities Climate Finance Report, but I'll go into the report in much more detail during this presentation. Next slide, please. So before we get started, a bit about the Cities Climate Finance Leadership Alliance. We are a coalition of leaders committed to deploying finance for city-level climate action at scale by 2030. We are the only multi-level and multi-stakeholder coalition aimed at closing the investment gap for urban and subnational climate projects and infrastructure worldwide. Next slide, please. And this is just a snapshot of some of our members. So we involve over 80 stakeholders in the urban climate finance space, including demand for city climate finance represented by local and global city networks, supply of city climate finance from MDBs, bilateral aid, private sector and other actors, national governments and other enablers, including UN-led organizations and other researchers and implementers. Next slide, please. Great, so today I'm going to talk about the State of Cities Climate Finance Report in much more detail and what it means for closing the city's climate finance gap. The 2024 edition of the State of Cities Climate Finance provides the most comprehensive available assessment of urban climate finance flows and needs. And as you saw briefly in the previous presentation, one of the other values of the report is the granular breakdown of both flows and needs by region, sector, instrument, and other metrics. During this presentation, I will showcase the main results of our flows and needs assessment on the amount of financing that cities need to reach climate goals. But our main goal is really to look forward and understand how to close the city's climate finance gap. So to that end, I'll also cover briefly a set of recommendations and our new 4C agenda to close the city's climate finance gap. So as has been said multiple times today, and I'm sure throughout the rest of the week, We can never really say it enough. Cities are indispensable actors in the climate transition, and they need much more investment to meet climate goals. And I think this has really been underscored by the previous presentations from Minal, from Siir, and I hope to make that point again today. Next slide, please. We know that over half the world's population currently live in cities, and this is only set to increase by 2030 and 2050. Cities are already at the forefront of climate change impacts, from floods to extreme heat, which often hit the urban poor the hardest. In 2024 alone, you have probably heard or even lived several examples of these types of climate disasters at the city level. Flooding earlier this year in the south of Brazil, for example, displaced over 200,000 people and caused over $3.7 billion worth of damages, primarily in urban areas. We also know that urban heat effects are increasing. Cities are actually heating up at twice the rate of other areas, and this is already impacting large cities such as Delhi in India, which saw temperatures over 52 degrees Celsius earlier this year. These kinds of disasters will only be more frequent and have a tremendous impact on city residents. So, as has been underscored by the previous presenters, we must consider how cities will grow, how climate change will impact city residents, the urban poor, and urban infrastructure altogether, and what types of financing is needed to help achieve a sustainable transformation in this space. Next slide, please. At CCFLA, we focus on several systemic challenges that we think are preventing city climate finance from flowing. We see these challenges as a huge opportunity to invest in the future by investing in sustainable and resilient urban infrastructure. Cities need more climate finance, but they also must be empowered to take the action needed to safeguard their futures against climate change. So bringing in a bit of the policy perspective to showcase the policy and finance interdependence here. Scaling urban climate finance really requires acknowledging and addressing several systemic challenges. Here we focus on four. The first is insufficient global and national commitment to urban climate action. As we saw in the previous presentation, many national development contributions and other types of national plans do not include urban needs, and these are often overlooked in national climate discussions. Second, weak enabling environments for city-level climate policy and finance. Inefficient cooperation between levels of government can really miss the opportunity to strengthen the enabling environment for cities. Third, capacity gaps among cities and local governments really hinder climate action and prevent the ability of cities and local governments to create the types of climate action plans, climate investment plans, and climate goals that would lead to more finance. And finally, there's inadequate capital mobilization at the city level. Cities struggle with poor creditworthiness. They often have limited access to capital markets and limited fiscal space and capacity. This is particularly pronounced in emerging markets. Overall, understanding and overcoming these challenges are a key part of the strategy to mobilize city climate finance at scale by 2030, and I think are a really important part of the discussion beyond just the numbers and the findings and the models here. Next slide. So now I'll talk about where we are now with urban climate finance flows from 2019 to 2022. Next slide, please. As mentioned, I'll walk through some of the highlights from our urban climate finance analysis, and there's much more detail in the report. We build on CCFLA's previous 2021 State of Cities report, ensuring data comparability over time and facilitating an understanding of evolving trends in urban climate finance. We at CCFLA track urban climate finance by combining project-level investments and capital expenditure estimates across various sectors. Most of the data that we use come from Climate Policy Initiative's Global Landscape of Climate Finance, CDP, and other databases. Climate finance tracking faces limitations, and we therefore present a conservative estimate of the resulting numbers. Limited disclosure from private actors, particularly in key sectors such as transport and buildings energy efficiency, a lack of standardized reporting, inconsistent definitions, and insufficient granularity all combine to make it difficult to track urban climate finance. This year, for the first time, we also present a granular estimation of urban mitigation needs by compiling underlying scenarios to estimate the amount of mitigation finance that is required for cities by 2030 and 2050. And the report is available on our website along with our data sets, so you can download them and conduct your own analysis. Next slide, please. I know there are many researchers and modelers in the room, so as with any good presentation, I'll start with a definition. We need to define what is urban climate finance. Here we refer to financial resources directed at activities aimed at limiting city-induced greenhouse gas emissions and to activities intended to address climate-related risks by cities. And so I hope the slides are a bit more clear in the room. Apologies if they're not. This is all in the report. The graphics are very clear. But we can see here the way we define city climate finance varies by sector. So we have several sectors that require in-city boundaries. Basically, they must be kind of physically located within the city boundary. We use functional urban areas to determine the boundaries of cities. And then there are several sectors that maybe are located outside, the investments are maybe located outside of the city boundary, but they exclusively serve city dwellers. So we include them in our definitions of city climate finance. And using this definition, we've provided an updated comprehensive climate finance taxonomy for urban mitigation and adaptation. That's included as an appendix on the main report. And we have put a lot of work into defining this over time between the last report, this report, and other tracking activities. But we also welcome feedback on the taxonomy, as this is kind of a key piece of continuing efforts in the tracking space. Next slide. So finally, the results. And we have a Sankey diagram here that indicates how finance is flowing from sources and intermediaries on the left to all the way through to sectors on the right. So our headline numbers in 2021 and 2022, urban climate finance reached 831 billion US dollars. And this diagram shows the granularity and the breakdown of that total. The first column shows the breakdown by sources of finance. We have public finance providers in blue, private finance in orange, and then purple is indeterminate. We cannot determine the split between public and private. Here we can already see that private finance accounted for almost half, 49% of the total, and public finance for 22% of the total. The second column shows the instruments used to disperse urban climate finance. Equity financing was the most used instrument, accounting for 312 billion US dollars, or 38% of the total tracked urban climate finance. The third and fourth columns show the regional destinations and the split by climate use, mitigation, adaptation, and dual uses. I'll go into that in much more detail in the later slides. And finally, on the right, we have the sector breakdown, and this indicates that transport followed by buildings and infrastructure were the largest sectors receiving urban climate finance. Next slide, please. So tracked urban climate finance has more than doubled since 2017 and 2018, and yet a large gap remains. Most of this increase is from increases in climate finance on a comparable basis, and a very small amount is from an increase in methodology, improved methodology and increased data access. The main increase here comes from an increase in private finance, which has more than tripled since 2017 and 2018, and public finance has more than doubled. Next slide, please. So here we have the breakdown, private and public finance. So private and public actors accounted for 49 and 22% respectively of the total climate finance. We see a very significant role of private actors. That's in the orange chart on the bottom, particularly households and individuals. And then public finance is shown in the blue chart on the top of the slide, which public finance again more than doubled from 2017-2018. The largest single source of public finance was national governments, coming in at 36% of public finance provision. These flows, however, have largely stagnated, rising only by 10% from 2017 or 2018. So the largest increase in public finance actually came from development finance institutions, DFIs, which more than doubled their contribution from 2017 and 2018. It's important to note that public finance overall remains severely unevenly distributed. Half went to China alone, while remaining emerging markets and developing economies received only 7%, and least developed countries less than 2%. Private actors almost tripled their urban climate finance contributions, and almost half of tracked private finance came from households and individuals, largely through purchases of electric vehicles. Next slide, please. As we saw in the Sankey, most urban climate finance goes to mitigation. Transport represented 52% of these overall investments, and private entities were the main providers of urban mitigation finance, while public actors financed 173 billion US dollars. Next slide, please. Overall, tracked urban adaptation finance remains low at just under $10 billion US dollars total. This Sankey here shows the flows of adaptation finance that we're able to track. To break it down into even more detail, one of our main findings here is that water and wastewater activities in the urban space received 68% of urban adaptation finance. However, we really face severe data limitations and limited definitions of adaptation finance that prevent us from tracking more adaptation projects or from identifying the adaptation component of some existing infrastructure investments. So the results here are very interesting in terms of where adaptation finance is flowing in cities, but overall, we're only able to track, again, less than 10 billion US dollars total, which is a very small percentage of total climate finance compared to mitigation finance. Next slide, please. Now we see a regional breakdown. So urban climate finance mostly went to cities in developed economies at 339 billion US dollars total, and China received 336 billion US dollars total for urban climate finance. Cities in the rest of emerging markets and developing economies received only 11% of the total. Least developed countries received just 1%. As was shared in the previous presentations, as we know, urbanization will increase rapidly in regions such as sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. So there's a need to increase investment for climate resilient infrastructure that addresses these underlying inequalities and does not reproduce these regional inequities, and is flowing towards the areas where cities are actually growing the most and have the most climate needs. Next slide, please. One important finding of the report, which follows what we've seen in previous climate finance tracking reports, is the importance of the domestic market. The majority of urban climate finance was sourced domestically in all regions except for sub-Saharan Africa. Domestic climate finance here means finance that was raised and spent within the same country that we're able to track. So public domestic climate finance was mostly concentrated in East Asia and Pacific, which was led by China and then followed by Western Europe. Therefore, what we see from this is that cities in these regions will likely continue to achieve their climate goals based on the availability of strong domestic financing. However, cities in underserved regions, such as emerging markets and developing economies or other regions, will need to bolster their access to domestic markets and strengthen domestic markets for climate finance. Otherwise, international finance probably won't keep up with climate goals for cities. Great. So now I'll talk about our needs assessment. So we looked at what cities need to achieve key climate targets by 2030 and 2050. The way this works is it's built on CPI's growing practice of needs estimation. So what happens is we compile existing underlying predictive scenarios about climate finance needs that are required to achieve 1.5 degrees Celsius for mitigation and other climate scenarios for adaptation. We really face big data gaps for certain sectors and regions. In particular, we find very little data on urban adaptation needs and urban adaptation projected investments. So here we present the data that we have, and we show a range of estimates due to the uncertainty in the underlying climate trajectories and compounding climate risks. Next slide, please. We find that for mitigation alone, cities will need $4.3 trillion per year by 2030 and over $6 trillion US dollars by 2050. This represents a 5-fold increase that's required in climate finance to achieve these goals. We show in this chart the growth of urban mitigation finance to contextualize that despite progress in climate finance flows, a large gap still remains to achieve city climate targets. Estimates here again are based on current climate scenarios, but if this gap persists and urban climate investments continue to fall short of what's needed, the cost may continue to increase over time, and the gap will increase as emissions also increase. Next slide, please. Very briefly here, we have a breakdown of city needs. So we have transport, energy, and buildings that dominate city mitigation needs. This tracks what we find for urban climate finance flows, so it's not incredibly surprising. During the period until 2030, transport is estimated to account for 40% or over 1.7 trillion US dollars annually of investment needs in cities. Most of these climate-aligned transport investments will focus on urban areas and are driven by the requirements for electric vehicles and urban rail systems primarily. Next slide. So I'd like to share our adaptation needs numbers as we do in the report, but really put them in context. So adaptation needs are more difficult to project for several reasons. First of all, there's a general lack of data, particularly from the private sector. Second, as we know, there's no really collectively agreed upon quantified goal for adaptation, which makes it very difficult to project what types of investments are needed for cities when we look forward. However, we know that cities are already facing increasingly high costs of inaction, as well as directly responding to climate risks and disasters and spending quite a lot of money when they do so. So this helps contextualize why we think our estimates are really underestimates. What we find is that in emerging markets and developing economies, which that's what our estimate covers, we see that cities need $147 billion per year until 2030 and over $165 billion by 2050 to respond to key climate hazards. Next slide, please. So what does this all mean, putting this together? Closing the city's climate finance gap. Based on this data, we'd like to provide 4 key recommendations that I'll go through briefly. Next slide, please. Our first is that we must improve the quantity and quality of urban climate finance. This is clear from the scale of the gap between flows and mitigation needs and from the importance of cities in the international scale, which we heard about from the previous presenters, and the rising cost of adaptation for cities. What we mean here is beyond scaling the quantity of climate finance, we need to enhance the quality of finance, how it is distributed among sectors, how it is used to address underlying inequities within cities as well as between cities in different regions, and how it can strengthen enabling environments to further support and enable city and subnational climate action. Second, we must strengthen domestic markets through the strategic use of public finance. We saw that the majority of urban climate finance is sourced and provided domestically, and this trend is likely to grow. The urban climate finance ecosystem will therefore need to bolster domestic markets so cities and local governments can better access both public and private finance. Third, we must rapidly scale urban adaptation finance, particularly in emerging markets and developing economies. This will include channeling investments into adaptation efforts in developing economies and most likely expanding our taxonomy of risks and adaptation investments to effectively address and respond to climate disasters and incorporate resilience investments into existing planned infrastructure development. And finally, we must improve data and tracking of urban climate finance flows and needs. Tracking urban climate finance, which is the work that we've been developing through the State of Cities series, generates crucial data to support policy and investment decisions by both national and subnational policymakers, as well as impact-oriented investors and government officials. This data is essential to identify progress, gaps, and opportunities in the green transition of cities, and more data will help make better decisions. Final slide, please. So I'll wrap up here with an agenda that we propose to close the urban climate finance gap. We call it the 4 C's agenda. So hopefully people will remember it after learning a lot of facts and statistics earlier today. The framework can help guide action to achieve our recommendations and close the gap. Very briefly, our 4 C's are commitment to raising urban issues on the global and national climate finance agenda, 2, collaboration between actors to improve climate finance flows for cities, 3, capacity building for public and private actors to respond to climate change in cities and achieve urban climate finance goals. And then finally, C, for capital mobilization at the city level, we must increase the capital that's available for cities to invest in climate action. And that's it. So thank you so much. And I encourage you to visit the website and read the report for more insights. And please, I look forward to any questions that you have today.
Thank you, Jessie, for the fantastic presentation. Basically, we have just 2 minutes before we wrap up. So I'll just ask maybe if there are any questions out there.
Yeah, good. No, those are 3 great talks. Hi here, Bas van Rijven, IASA. Especially on the finance needs, I was wondering, what are those based on? Could you elaborate a bit? Because I understood from a review 2 years ago, actually, that the finance needs of cities are very wildly between what cities estimate themselves in terms of scoping of what's actually included, and therefore also in magnitude. And so I wonder whether there's any improvement in sort of having standardized definitions of what climate financing in cities would mean and calculating that.
Jessie?
Sure. Yep, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, thank you for the question. So to go more into our needs methodology, we call this, we're actually not compiling a database of what cities are asking for, which we would call kind of bottom-up needs. We're actually looking at what we call a top-down needs assessment, and Climate Policy Initiative has been pioneering this methodology globally for climate finance. And then for the city side, we basically figure out what percentage of that is urban and can be attributed to urban areas based on our definitions of climate finance. So the top-down needs are compiled from these underlying, mostly sectoral predictive estimates. For example, projecting transport needs to climate aligned transport investment needs by 2030 and 2050, climate aligned building investment needs by 2030 and 2050, and then for the energy sector as well, in terms of what financing is needed to achieve 1.5 under different scenarios. And so we benefit from the CPI database, which compiles this all together, provides globally climate finance needs for different sectors. And then we at the cities team look at the sectors, and based on our project level data, our understanding of the way cities are growing and how cities use each of the different kind of sectoral investments and our definitions of city climate finance, we make an urban cut of that data, and that's how we got to these numbers for city climate finance needs. I think it could be really complemented by more comprehensive data on the bottom up side. CDP and ICLEI track are doing a lot of this in terms of surveying cities and seeing what cities are asking for climate projects. But just as you say, it's not standardized. Different cities have different definitions of climate needs. They have different targets, and there's not a comprehensive database with equal representation from cities in different regions. So we were unable to fully incorporate that into this edition of the report. But I think that that's an important piece of the puzzle that's missing, because it's not only about this kind of top-down climate projection, it's also about what cities are actually asking for in terms of financing projects.
Thank you, Jessie. So keeping with time, I would like to kind of close and basically thank Minal, Siir, and Jessie for their fantastic presentations. If you have questions, please come back to me. I will share their email IDs with you, and you can basically continue the conversation forward. With that, hopefully I give the desk to Detlef. Please give them a big round of applause.